G'day, AJ Mahara here. Borderline personality and narcissistic personality, two different personality disorders, as the APA refers to them with their pseudoscience and hegemony with Big Pharma, is not all predicated on whether one has empathy or not. So it's not all about empathy, but nor does it make any sense that people would want to somehow settle for a person with BPD or even a narcissist if only they could just not split or not hurt you in the ways that they do, and whether they have empathy or not, it's not important. Well, the criteria, what happens for people that get diagnosed with BPD and NPD, which is not the same. It's early childhood emotional arrested development at two different ages and stages of early childhood. BPD before 2, narcissistic personality between 3 and 5, or around the age of 3, more to the point, as James F. Masterson says. But what's really important here, I think there's a real problem in the world today, or at least on the internet today. This idea that empathy. I've been online for 26 years now, right? I've been working with clients for 31 years. Never before, the last, 7 to 10 years maybe, if it's been that long, never before was everybody going on about empathy, and the empath narrative. I mean, whatever anybody believes is their own business, but I would just say there's nothing really healthy about this idea that whether a person has BPD or NPD, it's all about that BPD or NPD is all about the fact that if they have empathy or not. No, because there's so many other criterions, and BPD and NPD, each in their own right, are spectrums of narcissistic personality. There's a spectrum of narcissistic personality disorder. There's a spectrum of borderline personality, and so everybody isn't the same, and everybody isn't doing what everybody online says they're all doing. But what matters most is what you've experienced and what you've gone through. But it's also important that you don't increase your suffering by conflating it with misinformation or, too much focus on all that stuff. But I think, the empathy, the focus on empathy for people in general in this, when it comes to BPD, NPD, what is it, what is BPD, what is NPD, what is codependency, why are people with codependency often in these relationships with people with BPD or NPD, and I'm going to have a lot coming on that soon, and again, like I said, there'll be some here and there'll be some elsewhere. But what I just want to say in this video that's so key is, if you're really focused on empathy or you think you're an empath, why don't you maybe rethink that a little bit? Because I wonder where compassion has gone, right? Because we used to hear more about compassion, or lack thereof. In the diagnosis of people with BPD, they, not in the diagnostic criteria, but people with BPD struggle with empathy and the expression of it. But it doesn't mean they don't feel it, doesn't mean they don't have the capability for it. But if you've been really hurt by somebody with BPD, you likely experienced times when they might have had empathy and times when it was the exact opposite, especially when, they split and they're in the approach avoidance, fear of abandonment, fear of engulfment, struggles, etc., which, they weren't born with, but were created in their childhoods for reasons, right? And so it's all about defense mechanisms. So BPD or NPD is not just a series of behaviors. There are underpinnings, there are impulses, there are so much else to understanding what BPD and NPD truly are, each in their own right, and why people with BPD and NPD, people with BPD will struggle with empathy, people with, or the expression of it, and sometimes it's just not there when they're triggered, for sure, but they have the capability of it. And this is a big difference between people with BPD and people with NPD, but you're not always going to see that when you're in a relationship with someone with BPD, right? You're going to say, well, this person has no empathy for me, and likely they're not having any empathy at a time when that's how you feel. That's what is happening for you. But the diagnosis, the reality of BPD and the reality of NPD is not predicated solely or in some central way on whether people have or can express empathy or not. It's way deeper than that. There are underpinnings of the behavior. In narcissists and in borderlines, the behaviors that you experience and the way that they can treat people, many, not all are untreated. Not all narcissists are the same. Not all people with BPD are the same. But what you're experiencing, you might well not be experiencing any empathy. But empathy, I think, has just become too overblown a topic. Because for people with codependency, what you're probably looking at is, you're probably experiencing is toxic empathy. And then what does that mean? What's the difference between empathy, in the emotional sense of what it used to mean, but I don't know, people have gone off and made it, a whole bunch of other definitions for it. But empathy is, too much empathy isn't healthy, and no empathy isn't healthy. And so we see a lack of empathy in people with BPD, but the capacity for it, and sometimes they have empathy. And we see really an inability to have any empathy in narcissists, but more toward the, higher end of the spectrum, the more severe. And there isn't much empathy from a narcissist. But the point I'm trying to make here is, why is everybody focused on empathy? Because, if empathy is central to the core of your pain right now, on the other side of a borderline or a narcissist, it goes back to childhood, and it goes back to failed empathy at a time when that was threatening on a biological level in infancy, and in different ways, it may be in a bit older childhood, was affecting your, having unmet needs and being caused a lot of pain. But more to the point, is it just empathy? No, I think it's about compassion. I think it's about when people are wounded and have codependency, it's a lack of compassion, it's parentification, it's unmet needs, it's intermittent needs met, but if needs are met at all, only intermittently. There's a whole lot of things going on for different people with codependency. But this focus on empathy, I really believe, is unhealthy, and really would be best if it was taken out of the conversation. But let me just say again that BPD or NPD, people with BPD have a capacity for empathy. Most, not all. It's a spectrum. So the more severe people have BPD, then they're really lacking in empathy. But not all people with BPD are lacking in empathy, but they might not be able to express it. Narcissists, generally speaking, do not have empathy for anyone. So again, the borderline's locus of focus is internal, protective, defensive. They don't have a self from which to see other, to know other. There's no boundary between them and you. So they externalize everything out onto you. And this, among other things, leaves a lot of people with codependency believing like, oh, this is all my fault. Or if I didn't say this, or if I did it, because they'll tell you it's your fault, but it's not. So, and narcissists, a little bit different, but I don't think every narcissist knows exactly what they're doing either. Many do. But, people talk about narcissistic personality disorder in a very simplistic or uberly jargon way, whichever end of the spectrum, tend to say all the same thing, which is that they're all the same, which is not true. Because there's a difference between the covert, vulnerable, fragile narcissistic personality disordered individual and an overt, grandiose narcissist. And there's many subtypes in BPD, more than the 4 that you might have seen. I've covered a couple, but more than the 4 you might have seen out there on the internet a lot or on YouTube. So it's very complicated, and you don't need to get yourself all up in the complication of that. But let me just reiterate again that the core issues in BPD or NPD are not centered around empathy or no empathy. They are much deeper and much more entrenched and much more about protecting a lost self. In both the case of BPD to a certain extent with a false self, and the narcissistic false self, loss of self, arrested emotional development but between age of 3 and 5. So people with narcissistic personality disorder really have stronger narcissistic infantile defenses to where they don't really feel their feelings, and so they have no reference between self and other either. But the overt grandiose narcissist, for sure, and the covert to an extent narcissist, they are focused externally, right? And that's where they're after supply. That's not what people with BPD are after. And the last thing I'll just say here too, again, empathy being some measurement, but not the key thing that defines any of these personality disorders. Then we talk about antisocial personality disorder, right? The psychopath. Well, they have zero empathy. And more to the point, you can't interchange, or people shouldn't, but they do anyway, right? Can't interchange what's happening in borderline personality across the spectrum, and people aren't all the same, or what's happening for people with NPD across the spectrum, and they're not all the same. You can't then mix and match, but talking about BPD, NPD, and then antisocial personality disorder, like there's some kind of continuation of something similar. Because I've heard people say that, the big problem with psychopaths is they just lack empathy. My God. No, well, yeah, they don't have any empathy, but they don't have a conscience. And the emotional centers of the brain as psychopaths are not connected to the rest of to the brain. So empathy is overrated. If you're caught in the empathy trap, if you have codependency, you probably are into what I would call almost at this point malignant empathy, unhealthy empathy, toxic empathy. You really need to get in therapy and work on this too, because this empathy narrative is run amok, and it's just not the central core reason why people have BPD or why they have NPD or why they have ASPD. So there's a lot there that I think people are fighting against, that it would really behoove you to work on mindfulness and radical acceptance of the fact that his relationship just didn't work. Relationship wasn't good for you. Now you're in a world of hurt, whether it was BPD or a person with narcissistic personality disorder, or it was a psychopath. And don't mix all, some people out there mix all the terminology together like they're all the same. They're not. They're just not. And then even within each category, they're not all the same again. So we can say the same thing about people with codependency, which, by the way, I'm going to have a lot coming on, like I've said. And I will only be having sort of trailer videos that will be introducing video series on this. But coming from me soon is the delineation. I talked about the reason why codependence is not codependent personality disorder in the DSM. It escaped it by about that much, and for reasons that don't really make sense. I'm not into pathologizing people, but the information I have coming forward will be, in a way, putting codependency in a framework of understanding that's been pioneered decades ago by mental health professionals, that codependency is in fact very, very close to being a personality disorder, that it has traits with the overlap with BPD and with the overlap with dependent personality, but even codependency just within that overlap in that middle space is this close to being a personality disorder. So I want you to really take it seriously. I'm not going to really forward that in a sense of trying to pathologize people with with codependency, because we already know what's happening to a lot of people with BPD who are going to heal and recover, have healed and recovered, and don't deserve the stigma or the judgment anymore. But the key thing with all of this is, as I've said here, get off the empathy hamster wheel, because empathy is important, and empathy is, along with mirroring and attunement and what happens in your attachment in childhood, hugely important in a developing infant and a developing child through the early stages of childhood development. After that, empathy has now been blown into, taken away from its original definition, and it's being, just used and abused, what empathy really means. And then there's a cognitive empathy, the empathy paradox and trap. So I would just suggest you think about this. I'll have more coming, but it's really important that you maybe don't hear somebody saying that BPD, NPD, ASPD, cluster B, it's all about whether they have empathy or not, because that's not the delineating reason that people are diagnosed with any one of those three things or many other things in mental health. So people struggle with things, and it affects how they feel, and it affects how they can reach out to others or not, of course, especially in cluster B, but in codependency as well. So most people with codependency are in an empathy paradoxical trap. Well, it's rather dichotomous. It's experienced dichotomously. It's described dichotomously by many people with codependency, but it is not so unlike. It doesn't manifest the same way as it does for people with BPD, but the underpinnings and the motivations and what happened in childhood and the reality of the pain, yeah, it's not so dissimilar. But the bottom line is, get off the empathy path, get off the empathy trail, and realize that in codependency recovery, and I'm out here to work with you if I resonate with you, I help my clients to understand empathy and what it really is and the place it belongs in and how it's really overblown right now. And if you think that you're an empath, well, you're free to think whatever you want, but you might not be helping yourself out, because being an empath seems to be becoming more every day about defense and about the obliteration of people's not only healing and recovery for real, but the obliteration of the idea that they could ever be hurt again, or which is a delusion, and the obliteration of the idea of the sacred strength that you can find in your vulnerability through a healing and recovery journey. So I hope that was helpful or food for thought. Take care.